Hi, my name is Christina Zuckerman, and I will be doing a presentation on the regulation of the gastric phase of digestion. So, the digestive system is the way in which the body gets its electrolytes, water, and nutrients that it needs. Typically, as food moves through the GI system, it's separated into three phases: the cephalic phase, the gastric phase, and the intestinal phase. The cephalic phase takes place in the mouth and the esophagus. The gastric phase takes place in the stomach, and the intestinal phase takes place in the small and large intestine. In this presentation, I will be focusing on the regulation of the gastric phase of digestion, which takes place in the stomach. So the stomach has three major functions. The first is storage, which is extremely important in the regulation of the passage of food from the stomach to the small intestine. So if food moves too quickly from the stomach to the stomach to the small intestine, the body would not have a good reaction to this, and we'll discuss that a little bit more later. The second major function of the stomach is digestion. This occurs mechanically and chemically, with the addition of many gastric secretions in this phase. And then the last major function is defense. And defense happens when the stomach fights off any bad bacteria or pathogens that we ingest in our food that we eat before they get to the rest of the body. So the stomach stops these pathogens before they get to the rest of the body. It is important to ensure that the body has a balance between digestion and defense, so that there's no harm to the stomach or any of the surrounding organs in the body. And then some of the diseases in which the regulation of these two functions fails, we will discuss later. Okay, so as food enters the stomach, a series of short reflexes are initiated from the stimuli in the gastric lumen, such as distension or the presence of amino acids, and the gastric phase begins. So there are three parts to the stomach: the top part, which is the fundus, the middle part, which is the body, and the bottom section, which is the pylorus. So when food enters the stomach through the cardiac sphincter at the top of the stomach expands in order to hold the amount of food that's entering, and this is known as receptive relaxation. The fundus is where most of the food is stored, so the top part of the stomach there, that's where most of the storage occurs, until it's ready to be digested, which happens in the middle and the bottom part of the stomach, and then it passes to the small and large intestine through the pyloric sphincter at the bottom there. So like I said earlier, if too much food is passed to the small and large intestine at one time, the body doesn't react very well to this because the large intestine isn't able to absorb as much water as it should at the single time here. So this would result in a watery stool or diarrhea. So the next two parts of the gastric phase are digestion and defense. And during this phase, a lot of the gastric secretions are put into the stomach. So in the lumen of the stomach, there are gastric pits that lead to gastric glands. And these gastric glands contain cells that produce many different types of enzymes, hormones, paracrine molecules, and gastric acid. And these are those gastric secretions that you see on the slide here. So along with mechanical digestion done in the stomach, food enters with many of these gastric secretions in order to produce chyme, and then that chyme eventually passes on to the small intestine in small increments. And then we will speak about each gastric secretion briefly. So the first gastric secretion that you see here is gastrin, and gastrin is a hormone that is released by G cells in response to the presence of amino acids or peptides in the stomach, and it is also released in response to distension. So when food enters the stomach distends to be able to hold all the food, and then eventually gastrin would be released as a result of that. And then two other things that cause gastrin release are coffee, or gastrin-releasing peptide also causes the release of gastrin. So the primary function of gastrin is to cause gastric acid release by acting directly on parietal cells. So parietal cells release gastric acid, we'll see that later. And gastrin could act indirectly by causing the release of histamine, which is also on the slide here, which causes gastric acid release as well. So the second gastric secretion you see here is gastric acid, which we just talked a little bit about. Gastric acid is one of the most important secretions in digestion, as it is secreted, 1 to 2 liters of it is secreted per day, and it can create a pH in the stomach as low as 1. So it has many functions in the stomach. First, it releases and activates pepsin, which aids in the digestion of proteins, and gastric acid also denatures proteins, which furthers their digestion. Second, it causes the release of somatostatin, which is a negative reflex gastric secretion, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's at the end of the slide here. And then gastric acid also inactivates salivary amylase, which halts the carbohydrate digestion that originally happened in the mouth during the cephalic phase. And lastly, gastric acid kills unwanted bacteria and pathogens from the food that we eat. So next, there are two enzymes that are secreted by chief cells, which are pepsin and gastric lipase, and these are both secreted by the chief cells. So as stated earlier, pepsin is released as pepsinogen, and then it's activated into pepsin by gastric acid, and then it aids in protein breakdown. Gastric lipase aids in the digestion of fats. And then lastly, we'll talk about the 3 paracrine secretions in the stomach. The first is histamine, and histamine is released from the enterochromaffin-like cells, or ECL cells, in response to gastrin or acetylcholine release. And then histamine eventually stimulates gastric acid secretion into the stomach. The next paracrine secretion is intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is also released by parietal cells that we discussed earlier, and it helps in the absorption of vitamin B12 later on in the intestines. And last, somatostatin is released by D cells, and this is in response to gastric acid, so it's a negative feedback. So as gastric acid is released, somatostatin is released, and then this eventually will stop the release of gastric acid. And as well as stopping the release of gastric acid, it also stops the secretion of pepsinogen in the stomach. So lastly, digestion and defense in the stomach needs to be balanced in order to prevent adverse effects, such as the ones you see here. And therefore, mucus cells in the gastric gland secrete mucus in order to create a physical barrier against autodigestion of the stomach. And it also secretes bicarbonate in order to produce a chemical buffer barrier. This is known as the mucus bicarbonate barrier. However, sometimes the mucus bicarbonate barrier doesn't function as well as it should, and this could lead to some of the disorders you see here, such as Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, peptic ulcers, and acid reflux. Peptic ulcers are often caused by NSAIDs and sometimes the bacteria H. pylori. All of these disorders occur as a result of too much acid in the stomach, and these disorders are typically treated with antacids, and sometimes more recently they have been treated with H2 receptor antagonists or proton pump inhibitors. Thank you.